He said, "I thought about the games a lot in the years that followed. Rugby is a character-building sport. Players learn how to conduct themselves on the field with the idea that they will learn how to conduct themselves in life. Knocks are given and taken, but you must play by the rules. When a player loses control of himself 3 times in a single afternoon, to my mind, that is a sign that in a crisis, the man is not capable of thinking clearly and acting rationally. Such a man will panic under pressure." Of course, years later, in the crisis at Chappaquiddick, Teddy would do exactly that. Hello and welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then welcome. I would love to earn your subscription today. I'm Jess Cannell, and on this channel, we read a lot about the Kennedys right now. We haven't always done so. I've done some books about the royal family and other topics, but right now we are definitely in a Kennedy season of the channel. And by that, I mean that on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays, we are reading this book. It's called The Kennedy Men, 3 Generations of Sex, Scandal, and Secrets, which is what we'll be doing today. But on other days, especially when we get closer to the weekend, I am reading through things associated with the Kennedy assassination. And so I would love for you to join me for any of it, for all of it, whatever floats your boat. Come along for the ride. In this book, we are reading stories that relate to the Kennedy family. This book started out telling the stories of Joe and Rose Kennedy. Here's Joe when he was an older man. But it's taken us through the stories of Jack and Jackie, their meeting, their early relationship, and of course his assassination. And then our last episode was all about Robert F. Kennedy, his rise in politics, and then sadly his subsequent 1968 assassination. Today we are getting into the rise and fall of Cadillac Eddie. That's part 5 of this book. And we're gonna just start out with chapter 12, called Teddy's Turn. I just wanna let you know that, because I was curious, I looked it up. When Jack was murdered, he was 46 and Teddy was just 31 years old. When RFK was murdered, he was 42 years old. So he was younger at the time of his murder than JFK had been at the time of his murder. I call them murders. They are assassinations, but also they are murders, and we need to reckon with that each one has compelling reasons why perhaps the facts that we've been told are not accurate, and justice has been unserved in each case. So Teddy was 36 at the time of RFK's murder/assassination. Rose had this to say about Teddy's upbringing. "I admit that with Teddy, I did things a little differently than I did with the other children. He was my baby, and I think every mother will understand this. I tried to keep him my baby." And I will say, just on Rose Kennedy's behalf, I also have 9 children like Rose did. And there is a sense in which, for sure, you cannot reproduce a childhood. Even 2 children who are close in age, even twins, do not get the exact same childhood experiences. But particularly when you have children over decades, you cannot make each child's experience in even the same home be identical to what their older siblings were. The events of the home, the commitments of the home, the maturity of the parents, the wisdom, the energy levels of the parents, it all changes. So you can't reproduce a childhood. And there is a sense in which, I mean, I can attest that your baby does feel like a different experience than your first, second, third children do. That there is a darlingness about the baby of the family that kind of can't be helped. They are cared for by everyone. They are adored and affectionately looked at by all of the older siblings. So they can't have the exact same childhood experience. And in that way, there's a sense in which, yeah, they're going to be babied no matter what. And the thing we've always talked about is at some point there has to be a baby. You can't not have the youngest child in the family, whether you have 2 children or 19 children. At some point there's going to be a baby of the family, and they're going to be the one that other people turn toward with care, but that themselves have no one younger to look after. So you can't help that part. But I will say, you don't have to say, I tried to keep him my baby. And the fact that she says she did do things differently, we'll see the fruit of that, and it was not good. Jack and Bobby were gone, each cut down in his prime by an assassin's bullet. Now it was Teddy's turn. But Edward Kennedy, the last of Joe and Rose's children, the last of their sons, had grown up in the shadow of his older siblings. His life had been one of shortcuts and minor scandals. That's not a good description. It is an accurate description. It's just such a tragic description. Shortcuts and minor scandals. Now he was alone, without the advice of his brilliant father and older brothers. If Joe and Jack had been raised to lead, Bobby and Teddy were born to follow. Bobby had done it superbly, learning politics at Jack's side, but Teddy was different. While his older brothers had benefited from their father's close attention, Teddy had been left to drift. Joe and Rose's oft-stated philosophy was that by focusing on the older children, they would then teach the younger children. But now the older ones were gone, and Teddy was on his own. Born when his mother was 41, he had been named for his father's trusted confidant, Eddie Moore, a man who could keep the secrets and was probably the first true Kennedy loyalist. Ted's early years had been far from stable. He had been sent off to boarding school at age 8. And by the time he was 13, he had attended 10 different boarding schools and day schools. 10 schools in about 5 years? That is crazy. That's such a huge amount of instability. When he made his first Holy Communion, it was Pope Pius the 12th, who administered the sacrament. Only 12, when his oldest brother Joe Jr. had died, he became the joy of his father's life. Peter Lawford said this: he came of age at a time when the old man wasn't feeling very well. Everyone else would be treading softly. But Teddy would come home, and his father's face would light up, and his spirits would rise. So Teddy was the buoyant, youngest child that does, I'll say from our home, there is something when you are in the trenches with young adults who are finding their way, or like this deep grief after the death of an older sibling. There is something stabilizing for the family that kind of grounds you in the most important things when you still have babies or young children in the home. For me, I can testify, it does lift the spirits and remind you, oh yeah, I'm not just in a household where everybody can fend for themselves and I can just sink into deep grief. There's still someone who is joyful and playful and needs my attention and response. So there is something buoyant and rising about having a little child when you also have older children that I've definitely experienced. As a grown man, Teddy would sail into a room, pick up his mother from behind and twirl her, saying, "How's my girl?" And then look over and say, "Hi, Dad, you having any fun?" He took a joy in life that his workaholic father and rigid mother could only marvel at. So he was the shining light that Peter Lawford referenced. Like Bobby, however, he was never a scholar. He made it into Harvard as a legacy, and then in his sophomore year, he had been expelled for cheating. We talked a little bit about this, but we get a description of it here. It says he had been failing Spanish and feared that it would keep him off of the varsity football team, so he paid a friend to take an exam for him. They were caught, and both of them expelled. It was shame and a disgrace. And so he kind of hid it away. He went and brewed it away at Hyannis and finally enlisted in the Army. But as was typical for him, he didn't bother to read the enlistment papers, and he signed up for 4 years instead of 2. The ambassador was horrified and made a call to a friend who managed to get a hold of Teddy's enlistment papers. He would serve only 2 years in the Army, and they would be in Europe, not Korea. In his 2 years in the Army, Teddy never rose above the rank of private. He returned to Harvard in the fall of 1953. Once he was back at Harvard, he made the rugby team. And during a match, this is very interesting for his early character. I'd never read this story. I wonder if you've heard it. During a 1954 match between Harvard and the New York Rugby Club, he got into 3 fistfights with opposing players and was finally thrown out of the game. The referee, a man named Frederick Caustic, said that Teddy was the only player he had expelled from a game in 30 years of officiating. So he spent 30 years refereeing rugby matches, and Teddy Kenny is the only person he ever expelled from a game. Here's his description. He said, "I thought about the games a lot in the years that followed. Rugby is a character-building sport. Players learn how to conduct themselves on the field with the idea that they will learn how to conduct themselves in life. Knocks are given and taken, but you must play by the rules. When a player loses control of himself 3 times in a single afternoon, to my mind, that is a sign that in a crisis, the man is not capable of thinking clearly and acting rationally. Such a man will panic under pressure." Of course, years later, in the crisis at Chappaquiddick, Teddy would do exactly that. By the time of his graduation in 1956, he had earned honors in government and history. He was still refused admission to Harvard Law School and spent the next year at The Hague's International Law Institute in the Netherlands. When he returned to the States in 57, he entered the University of Virginia's law school and graduated in 59. During that time, he managed Jack's 1958 Senate re-election campaign. But the warning signs of trouble continued. While he was in law school, he got called Cadillac Eddie because he was cited 4 times for reckless driving. 3 times were in 58, once was in 59. These violations included running red lights and driving with his lights off at 90 miles per hour in a suburban area. He was convicted of 3 violations and fined, but for whatever reason, his driver's license was never revoked. Yeah, we know whatever reason. According to psychohistorian Clinch, Teddy's repeated driving through red lights at 90 miles per hour was clearly compulsive behavior with overtones of hostility and self-destruction. Such actions endangered other lives as well, but this probably scarcely occurred to him. No, I mean, we see evidence. I have to keep reminding myself, by the way. Okay, this is a man in his 20s. When we get to Chappaquiddick, it's a man well into his 30s, pushing 40. We're not talking about a 17-year-old. We're not talking about a 21-year-old. We're not talking about prefrontal cortex, blah, 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 higher insurance rates. We're talking about the age at which, across the millennia, people have been expected to be settled and married, not still sowing wild oats, not still unreliable. But he is. At 1957, at the start of his 2nd year of law school, his sister, Jean, introduced him to 20-year-old Virginia Joan Bennett. The tall, blonde Manhattanville senior was an occasional model and had won various beauty pageants. When Joan graduated the following June, their engagement was announced in September, and Joan and Ted were married November 29th, 1958. Jack was the best man, Bobby an usher. Joan laughed later. "I had no idea what I was getting into. I was just a nice young girl marrying a nice young man." The couple barely had time for a 3-day honeymoon before they had to return to a rented apartment in Charlottesville for Teddy's final year. Ted received his law degree. They had a delayed honeymoon in South America, and then he and Joan spent the rest of the summer at Hyannisport, where plans were made for Jack's run for the presidency. pregnant, Joan went to stay with her parents until their daughter was born on February 27th, 1960. A month later, Joan joined Ted on the campaign trail. Joan would soon discover that she had married into a family whose men lived by a unique set of rules. He was philandering from the moment he was married, recalled Dick Tuck, an old family friend. Not one-night stands, but not much more than that. Kind of affairs of convenience. I think most normal people might have more than one affair, but not every week like Teddy. He was always chasing, looking for the conquest. I mean, okay, so this quote gives us everything. We actually get a little peek at the character of the person giving the quote. He says, I think most normal people might have more than one affair. So the person giving the quote is already saying, I'm cool with multiple affairs outside of your wedding vows that you've taken before God and your entire community. So we're given a clear look at this person's morals. And even still, Teddy is beyond the pale to this person. He's saying, this guy was crazy. He was philandering from the moment he was married. He was having affairs of convenience almost every week. Always chasing, looking for the conquest. So this tells us a lot about Ted, that even to somebody who's like, yeah, everybody has a few affairs, is still like, oh, goodness, Teddy's morals were beyond the pale. He was far outside the realm of normal. It helps us put Teddy into a category, and it's not a good category. Then there was the yachting incident. This story reminds me of the Rugby one. A family friend recalled a pre-White House cruise with Teddy from Cape Cod to Maine when Teddy became so enraged at the taunts from a nearby luxury yacht that he boarded the craft and tossed 8 men into the water while their terrified wives looked on. These men were complete strangers to him, and he tossed them overboard without even knowing if any of them could swim. This presents so many questions. I mean, one would be, this sounds like it happened before the assassinations of his brothers. So were the Kennedy men so revered that even when you go onto a boat of 8 friends, they don't seek to like hold you back and say, hey, you threw off one of our buddies, but we're not letting you do it to all of us. Get yourself together and get off our boat. Instead, can you picture it? Like one guy after the other, Ted's just throwing them in, and not a one of them stops and like says, no, you're not doing this. You grab his left arm, I've got the other one. We're going to get him in the hole and we're going to settle this guy down, or we're going to throw him overboard. They don't do that. Instead, just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they all go off while their wives look on horrified. That is an enraged Teddy. That is a man out of control. That is a man who gets thrown out after multiple fights and can't control himself in rugby, in yachting, or we see in the game of life. After Jack was elected president, Teddy made some noises about moving out west and perhaps buying a small newspaper, but Joe wouldn't hear of it. Now, when we read Ask Not, it's that red and black book right there, she made the point that this was perhaps the best chance that Teddy and Joan had for an actual normal life without being pressured into service. And she actually did like a character look at Ted and was like, look, he clearly was not an excellent candidate. And so if Ted and Joan were going to make it, then actually him having some other way to make a living, to make a life, and to get away together where they're kind of out of the influence of the Kennedys might have been their best bet, but there was no chance of that. In February of 1961, just shortly after Jack's inauguration, Teddy was sworn in as an assistant DA in Massachusetts, Suffolk County. He was basically killing time until he would be eligible to run for Jack's vacant seat in the Senate. Teddy didn't impress his colleagues in the DA's office. He had no feeling for the job, one of them said, none whatsoever, and he didn't try to develop any. He wouldn't work. He was listless and uninterested, and he tried cases only when he felt like it, which was seldom. Joan loved Boston from the beginning, and she and Ted moved into their first home, a red brick townhouse on Beacon Hill. Soon after, they bought a house on the Cape It was just a short distance from Hyannisport, and their second child, Edward Moore Jr., was born in September of 1961. But Teddy's legacy as a Kennedy man decreed that he must get into politics, and so he arrived in Washington in January 1963, one of the youngest senators in history, and Joan, one of the youngest senatorial wives. And like we discussed a couple chapters ago, it was the first time in history that three brothers simultaneously held high office in American government. His brother was the president, his other brother was the attorney general, and now he was the youngest senator in 1963. On June 16th, 1964, so he's been a senator for a year and a half at this point, Teddy was on his way to the Massachusetts Democratic State Convention, where he expected to be nominated for his second term in the Senate, when he was severely injured in the crash of a private plane. With him in the six-seater were fellow Democratic Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana, who was to deliver the keynote address, his wife, Marvella, and Edward S. Moss, Teddy's administrative aide. Teddy was the only passenger who hadn't buckled his seatbelt, which is a telling detail. It shows a recklessness and a lack of care even for his own life that is puzzling. As the twin-engine Aero Commander 680 crashed into a hillside, the Bays were thrown clear and escaped serious injury. There had been a heavy fog that caused this accident. It doesn't seem to be the result of any kind of, nefarious action. Zimney, the pilot, was killed. Moss suffered massive brain injuries and died within hours. Teddy had 6 spinal fractures and 2 broken ribs. He was listed in critical condition and remained in the hospital for 6 months. "It's amazing he's alive," said a doctor. I recently found the Life magazine that is about Ted Kennedy's recovery. I didn't want to buy the magazine, to be honest. Ted Kennedy, you guys know if you've watched the channel, we read through Chappaquiddick, and just in all of our readings, I find him very much to be a numbskull who it's not just that he is academically or intellectually inferior to his brothers. He felt that privately, and I wouldn't shame anybody for that. But it is the lack of care for others and lack of judgment that he displayed without any kind of actual consequences that really chaps my hide. So I'm not a fan of Ted Kennedy. I've had some of you say oh, but he did such great things in the last half of his career. And I'm like, a career built on lies and cover-ups and getting out from justice is not one that I can admire. So that said, I'm not a fan of Ted Kennedy. I didn't really want to buy it, but I knew that it would be actually really insightful for this particular thing. And so I've had it for a while, but it seems really appropriate that we go through it. So you can look forward to that as our next episode, probably released tomorrow. So be on the lookout for that. We will go through Life magazine as Congress opens Ted Kennedy's recovery in January of 1965. Teddy spent several of those months immobilized, unable to move anything but his hands, head, and feet. Very difficult. That certainly has our compassion regardless. This sort of circumstance is not a reason to think ill of Teddy Kennedy, apart from perhaps the not buckling of a seatbelt. But even the other people who, wore their seatbelts, 1 was dead, 2 were thrown clear. So it's not even a case where had he been wearing his seatbelt, he for sure would have been saved, because people who wore their seatbelts had various outcomes. So we can look at his recovery next time. The state convention nominated Teddy in absentia, and Joan began doing the campaigning for him. Now, she was a real rock star in this. She did a great job. Everyone praised her, and she really came into her own during this season. She thrived. But after his recovery, their marriage stalled. At parties, listen to this, he was known to ignore Joan completely all evening while he danced with other women. humiliating her and outraging her friends. Joan was somewhat overwhelmed by the Kennedy style. The house was always full of cooks and baby nurses and staff, she told a friend. When I said I didn't want a baby nurse, we had a baby nurse. Everything was done and taken care of, and I didn't do it. Angry, unhappy, she said, I was nobody, nothing, not needed. She would appear at dinner parties drunk and tell all within earshot that her marriage was in trouble. In July 1967, their third child, Patrick, was born, and the following year, Joan and Ted were swept up in Bobby's presidential campaign. Again, one of the things we learned in Ask Not, this is why we read these kind of, more for fun, a little more summer read books, but the reason why we do it is we get more of an overarching picture of the Kennedy family. And one of the things that book really talked about that made it clear was that the Kennedy family sort of would maneuver itself behind whichever person was the primary candidate at that moment. So they, of course, all adapted to push themselves behind Jack. And then when he was gone, and in 1967-68, when there's a presidential campaign for Bobby on the horizon, then everybody kind of, even though Ted's a senator, has his own life, has multiple children, they have a busy household, nevertheless, everybody's attention and everybody's sort of anxiety and care about their words, about their agenda, about any interviews that are given or profiles that are looked at is all through the lens of, will it help the primary candidate? Well, after Bobby's assassination, Joan was so distraught that she was unable to accompany the funeral party to Arlington. At the tumultuous Chicago Democratic Convention in 1968, the consensus was that the presidential nomination was Teddy's for the asking. So it's basically like, your brother was assassinated in 63. Your other brother, who had just come up to the point of really rallying the civil rights movement behind him and really showing his heart for the poor, has just been assassinated. And so if you want the nomination, it's yours for the taking. But he's 36 years old. He's barely old enough to run for president, but also we have seen, and we will see even more the following year. This will be the next episode after we go through the Life magazine. We'll see his judgment in Chappaquiddick. He was not remotely ready, and everyone around him recognized that. He and his advisors believed that although he could win the nomination, he could not win the election. It was too soon, and he was too young. So he declined to be a candidate. And get this, I didn't know this, that Hubert Humphrey was nominated for the presidency and actually offered to share and to make Ted the vice president. He declined that invitation to run as vice president. Very interesting to me that he did that. Well, strains are beginning to show in his marriage. Joan's drinking had escalated. She said, "It wasn't my personality to make a lot of noise, or to yell, or to scream, or to do anything. My personality was more shy and retiring. And so rather than get mad or ask questions about the rumors, or really stand up for myself at all, it was easier for me to just go and have a few drinks and calm myself down, as if I weren't hurt or angry. I didn't know how to deal with it. And unfortunately, I found out that alcohol could sedate me. So I didn't care as much, and then things wouldn't hurt as much." One of the things that Joan did for modern society is speak openly about her alcohol addiction. I think she pointed to 12-step groups, but also counseling. And no one in public life was speaking openly about these things, especially from a prominent, revered family. It was seen sort of as a scandalous thing to have anybody with mental problems, anybody with an addiction. And she just spoke openly about it, and really in the 80s and 90s seemed to kind of tackle her demons in ways that are very admirable. So we went through some of that in the book Ask Not, and if you're interested, I'd urge you to take a look because I found her a very inspiring figure, a very honest, tragic, honest, but ultimately gutsy figure who, didn't give up. Like here, sometimes we all feel like this. We all feel like it would be easier to just tune out. And she happened to have nobody giving her purpose or opportunity to serve and care for her family in ways that were important to her. And then when she would step up, like to campaign for her husband who's in the hospital, she got praised for a time, but then sidelined again. And while he goes off and dances with other women and focuses other places. And so she was kind of put in a situation where addiction was a very easy pitfall to fall into. Of course, the person makes the decision, and yet also the environment forms the person. The environment contributes to the person's vulnerability, and so we see that with Joan. So she has my compassion, and not just for the philandering, but for the difficult position she was put in to be in such a prominent place, but without any real purpose, without any respect, without any honor toward her as a functioning human in this whole arrangement. Well, Teddy actually seemed most in control of himself when he was on the floor of the Senate. And in January 1969, he won a tough fight for the position basically of assistant majority leader or majority whip. This is the second most important position in the Senate. It's a big deal. It means that basically you get everybody in line for a vote. You're going behind the scenes, you're wheeling and dealing, you're connecting and saying, look, if you'll co-sponsor this bill, then we'll sign on for your other bill, or I can get this many votes for this, or we're going to go ahead and get the party to get behind your bill, or whatever. So he's the guy who's wheeling and dealing behind the scenes and making things happen in the Senate. He was the youngest whip at 37 that had ever served in the Senate's history. By spring 1969, the stress of being the sole surviving son was beginning to take its toll. And reporters noted that he was drinking heavily, but they kind of basically gave him a year without any heavy-handedness. Like, you can't find negative articles about Ted Kennedy between the months when RFK passed away and Chappaquiddick. They just didn't exist. There was one reporter who was chronicling Teddy Kennedy initially for the purpose of thinking that he was going to gear up for a presidential run, and basically Life magazine was going to profile who is Teddy Kennedy for the world, kind of give them a look at Teddy Kennedy. And he was on this trip to Alaska that we're about to read about, and he later wrote about it, not for the big profile that was being planned for the summer of 1969, but actually that whole article shifted in tone and in focus when Chappaquiddick happened. But here is the description of the Alaska trip. It says, on an April trip to Alaska, concerned aides noted him sipping often from a small silver hip flask. Once, a slightly inebriated Ted announced, "They're gonna shoot my ass off the way they shot off Bobby's." So he did walk around with a very clear sense that, who's left? I'm the next target. My brother in government was assassinated. My next brother in government was assassinated. There's no other path for me but government. My family won't allow it. This is the point of the family dynasty. So they're going to do this. They're going to shoot me the way they did my brother. This does give me empathy for Ted. That would be a very difficult position to be in, to feel like this is your only path. You're not necessarily good at it. It wasn't what you necessarily picked. Now, he is good at it in some ways. He's good at being the whip. But to feel that this is the only path available to you, all the others have been shut off, and now you're the last hope, the last great hope for the family. On the plane home from Fairbanks, he roamed the aisle roaring, "Eskimo power! Eskimo power!" while spilling his drinks on other passengers. Very weird. Sounds like a frat boy. When an aide brought him hot coffee, Teddy splashed it, nearly scalding a baby, until somebody took his cup away. So just completely out of control, not in control of his own body even. Yet the media continued to protect Teddy as it had protected his father and brothers. Reporters are all informed of his behavior on this flight, and yet they declined to run the story. The Life reporter, Sylvia Wright, memoed her editors, "He's living by his gut. Something bad is going to happen." That is ominous. We're getting to the end of the chapter, and we will, like I said, we'll have this next time. But following this Life article, we'll be getting into the Chappaquiddick incident. Many of his episodes were fueled by alcohol, and it takes a lot of drinking to attract attention in Washington, but Teddy's consumption was, being sprinkled throughout Capitol Hill conversations. Everybody's noticing. He was the least discreet guy on the Hill, said one old congressional friend. I told him 10 times, Ted, you're acting like a fool. You're not nearly as discreet as you should be. And he would look down with a faint smile and say, yeah, I guess you're right. But he never listened. However, to the voting public, Teddy Kennedy was still the last of a great family, and as such, the strong favorite for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1972. So at this point, everybody's looking to 72. That's why Life went and sent an article to chronicle him, to basically present who is this Teddy Kennedy, to whom everybody thinks, yeah, he's probably going to be the candidate at some point, maybe even as soon as 1972. The night of July 18th, 1969 changed all of that, when in a series of events that have never been adequately explained, the senator became the first driver in 40 years to go off Dyke Bridge. His passenger, 28-year-old Mary Jo Kopechne, was killed. Ted's name would forever be linked with the scandal of Chappaquiddick. Yes, indeed. So we have just gotten through the section of Ted Kennedy before Chappaquiddick. The next chapter that we look at is titled Chappaquiddick. But next time, come back, we will get another good look at Ted Kennedy before Chappaquiddick. This would be in 1965, when people were looking at him, noticing his recovery after the plane crash. And this is even before RFK's passing. So this will give us a look at Ted Kennedy. I hope you'll come back for that. And then next week, I believe on Monday, will be when we get into Ted Kennedy's Chappaquiddick story. So hope you'll come back for those. This weekend, we have one on Rose Cherami, perhaps. So come back for that. Lots of good things, both about Ted Kennedy and about the assassination. I hope you find many things of interest on my channel, and I hope you have a great day. We'll see you soon. Bye.